Matthew chapter 7. We're going to begin reading in verse 1. I'm reading from the New Living Translation. Do not judge others, and you will not be judged. For you'll be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged. And why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying to your friend, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite. First get rid of the log in your own eye, and then you'll see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. Don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. They will trample the pearls, then turn and attack you. So Jesus is talking about judgment. And so I want to begin, I don't know how to do this another way. I think we have to begin at least with the context out of which Jesus is speaking. What is judgment in Israel? What is he calling up for the people when he says to them, do not judge? First thing we have to remember is that he's in the Sermon on the Mount, and he's already told us that we need to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. He's already told us that we need to forgive others when they sin against us. And if we refuse to do that, then God will refuse to forgive us. This passage flows out of that. In some ways, it's a more practical way of talking about what it means to love our enemies and what it really means to forgive them. So this is an extension of that. That's important. What we have to recognize is that Jesus is speaking out of a very particular cultural context. He's speaking to first century Jewish people who are trying to live out of what is called the law of Moses, the law that we find summarized in the Ten Commandments and expressed in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the law of Moses and the resultant culture of first century Judaism that had grown out of it was very concerned with law breaking. The story that seems to inform this, at least one of them, as to how the Jewish people understood what it meant for a person to be a lawbreaker and the consequences to the larger society, is a story we find in the book of Joshua. You remember in the book of Joshua, God is sending the Israelites into the land of Canaan as judgment on those people. So he's giving the Israelites the land of Canaan, but he's only sending them in because he had spent 450 years, according to Genesis 15, working with the people of the land of Canaan, and they had refused to follow his instructions. And so as a form of judgment, Israel comes in to displace them. And they go in the book of Joshua, to the first city, or at least major fortified city in the land of Canaan, to the city of Jericho. It's a huge city. It's got large walls. It has an army, all that kind of stuff. And they're able to defeat that city in miraculous ways. But God left them with a rule. He said, no one is to take any loot from the city of Jericho. That city's to be totally destroyed. One of the Israelites broke that law, a man named Achan, and he took some loot from the city and he put it in his own personal tent. Well, then Israel is going to attack the next city, and it's the city of Ai, and it's a tiny little city. It shouldn't have been they didn't need all their army. They just sent a small skirmishing force in because the city was so inconsequential. And yet they got routed. Many of their soldiers died. And Joshua is freaked out. He's like, wait a second, you told us to come into the land. We just took down this huge city with big walls. Now we go to this little encampment and they rout us. What's going on, God? Are you with us or are you not? And God says, well, somebody in your camp took loot from the city of Jericho. And for that reason, I've allowed your men to be killed when they came after Ai. And they do their search, and they find out that Achan was the man, and they have to judge him and punish him in order to get God to come with them again so that they can continue their conquest. That story is one of many that were formative for the way that the people of Israel thought about justice and thought about crime and law breaking and the proper response of the community. In this instance, God held the entire community accountable for the rebellious act of one family. And so for the law of Moses that Jesus is speaking into, law-breaking, sin, was a type of cancer that had to be excised before it could spread. There were no prisons in ancient Israel, at least not the way that we understand them today. There was some type of incarceration, like if a person accidentally murdered somebody, they were to go and live in a city of refuge until the high priest died. So that could be a long time if the high priest was young. It could be just a few years if he was old. So that was a little like that, but they were free, and that was for unintentional murder. If somebody died and it wasn't their intention that would happen. They also had a system of indentured servanthood, that if you got into debts, if you stole and you had to repay it and you didn't have the money to pay it back, then you could sell yourself into servanthood to a wealthier family, and you could work off your debt in that way. So that's a little like incarceration, but pretty different than the prisons we have today. And then in many instances, if law breaking couldn't be handled in those ways, then execution was the only other way. So there were no prisons. So for the people of Israel, judgment was about isolating wickedness and removing it from the larger community. So the enemy for the people of Israel when it came to crime was not the lawbreakers themselves, not the people, but the evil that they had embraced and brought into the body of Israel. That was the problem. And Israel knew no way of getting the wickedness out without getting the people out at the same time. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul speaks in the book of Ephesians out of this very assumption. In chapter 6, verse 12, he writes, "For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly spaces." Even the Apostle Paul in the New Testament is reminding us that evil is more of a system of power. It's more of a spiritual force. And when people do evil, they bring that spiritual force into the life of the body. And so, like cancer, sometimes it requires chemotherapy. This is the kind of thinking. It's interesting that even today there's a category of crime called copycat crimes, right? It apparently happens enough that we've named it. For the law of Moses, law breaking is as contagious as the flu. And so it needs to be stopped. And so in many ways, that's the justification for the execution of Jesus himself. Because the Jewish leaders have decided that he was corrupting the people of Israel with false doctrine. And so his execution was a way of stopping the spread of his dangerous ideas. So this is the culture of Israel. We have to understand this if we're going to understand what Jesus means when he says, "Do not judge." Now, Jesus had already confessed in Matthew 5 that he was not attempting to invalidate the law of Moses. So everything I've just described, we can assume Jesus assumed. But as we've been discussing through this series, what Jesus is telling us is that the law of Moses starts humanity on a road to someplace else. It's a starting point. And what Jesus is trying to help us to understand is where that law points. So I don't believe Jesus was discarding these assumptions. I think the assumption that sin is a spiritual force, that when people bring it into a community, it begins to infect the community and spread far beyond the person who originally does the sin. I think that that is still an assumption of the New Testament. But what I do believe is that Jesus was revealing that however necessary judgment and discernment must be, we must always safeguard the sacredness of the lawbreaker. We must always safeguard the sacredness of the lawbreaker. Jesus was helping us to understand, I think, three things. That the judgment God requires of his people must be limited, it must be careful, and it must safeguard the sanctity of those who are condemned. First point this morning is redefining judgment. Redefining judgment. Jesus is using the word judge, but he's redefining it for the people. Look at verse 1. "Do not judge others, and you'll not be judged." In Jesus' day, and perhaps even still, the idea of judging someone has been wrapped up and conflated with the idea of condemning someone. It's almost as though when I say don't judge me, what I mean is don't condemn me. Don't call me bad or evil. Now, the word to judge can also mean to discern or to decide. It has to do with looking at the evidence and making the best decision we can. I think Jesus very much likes that definition. I think it's the idea of condemning that he's speaking against. Here's a quotation from Dallas Willard I think will help us, and you're going to hear a lot from him today. "If we would really help those close to us and dear, and if we would learn to live together with our family and neighbors in the power of the kingdom, we must abandon the deeply rooted human practice of condemning and blaming." This is what Jesus means when he says, "Judge not." He's telling us that we should and that we can become the kind of person who does not condemn or blame others. As we do so, the power of God's kingdom will be more freely available to bless and guide those around us into his ways. When we condemn another, we really communicate that he or she is in some deep and just possibly irredeemable way bad as a whole, and to be rejected. We can decide whether a behavior is righteous or unrighteous, consistent with Jesus or not consistent with Jesus, helpful or harmful, without condemning the person who has chosen to embrace it. Do you believe that? Jesus apparently does. In fact, he's so serious about it that he says that he will be happy to use the same criteria you and I use to judge other people, to judge us when the time comes. Jesus is not saying that we should not show any discernment. We can't take this saying out of context. The entire Sermon on the Mount is about discernment. The entire Sermon on the Mount is about trying to decide what teachings are really Jesus' teachings and what are false teachings. What ways are really Jesus' ways and what ways are worldly ways. The whole sermon is about judging in that sense, about discerning right from wrong. He's certainly not telling us not to do here what he has been telling us to do everywhere else. He's also not telling us not to confront evil, because in Matthew chapter 18, just a few chapters later, he's going to give us a process by which we are to confront evil. So we have to read this in its context. But I think what he is saying is that do not condemn. Human judgment is too fallible to be absolute. It is too fallible to be absolute. You and I might think, in looking at another person and their behavior, that we know exactly how bad that person is. We might feel that we have all the evidence necessary to be absolutely certain that this person is a monster. But Jesus reminds us that only God has the perspective necessary to make a just judgment. All we can do is our best. And because we can only do our best, we are not in a position to condemn anyone. So we have to redefine judge as discernment and not as condemnation. Point number 2 is this: re-examining the one who judges. Re-examining the one who judges. Chapter 7, verse 2. For you will be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged. Verse 5. Hypocrite. First get rid of the log in your own eye, and then you'll see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. I think Dallas Willard can help us to understand what Jesus, I think, is implying. The plank in your eye is the condemnation itself. The plank in your eye is the condemnation itself. Listen to his words. How does Jesus know that those who judge in the sense of condemning others are hypocrites? Is it merely that there must be something wrong with us because there's something wrong with everyone and that we should not condemn others until we are perfect? No, that's not it. Rather, it is because he understands what condemnation is and involves. Condemnation is the board in our eye. He knows that the mere fact that we are condemning someone shows our heart does not have the kingdom rightness he's been talking about. Condemnation, especially with its usual accompaniments of anger and contempt and self-rightness, blinds us to the reality of the other person. We cannot see clearly how to assist our brother because we cannot see our brother. And we will never know how to truly help him until we have grown into the kind of person who does not condemn. Period. For Jesus, we have to recognize that if we are the one who is hurt, we have no standing to judge. If you yourself have been hurt by somebody, you're the worst person to try the case against them, because we can't see past our hurt or our condemnation or our pain to see the other person. Jesus is trying to help us to recognize something that was true in the law of Moses. A judge with a conflict of interest should not be adjudicating that case. And if you are the one who is hurt, you are the last person qualified to determine guilt. So what do we do in the church? Jesus tells us in Matthew 18, go get somebody else. Go get somebody else to look at the situation and see if they see guilt or not. Because you will always see it, because you're the one hurt. For Jesus, human judgment must never be conflated with condemnation or with true justice. That is left to God. We are only doing the best we can, and we can be wrong. And human justice must endeavor to ensure that the one tasked with deciding right and wrong is not the one who is carrying the hurt from the harm that was done. Because we need to see the other person. And all this comes together in the final verse. Respecting the judged is the final point. Look at verse 6. Don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. They'll trample the pearls, then turn and attack you. I would have to insist this is the key to the whole passage about judgment. This is actually what Jesus is driving for us to understand. What Jesus is helping us to see is that those who are being judged are sacred. Those who are being judged are sacred. It's the ones who have sinned who are the pearls. It's the ones who have sinned who are the sacred thing. We should never throw them to the dogs or to the ravenous crowds who are screaming for justice or blood. We must never throw a person who is condemned to the dogs. This is the most unchristian thing we could do. But some of us do it with our mouths, and we do it with our gossip, and we do it with our unforgiveness. We take a person who's harmed us, we decide that they're guilty, we don't want to know anymore, and then we hold them up to public ridicule. This is not the way of God. Because those who have sinned are sacred. Those who have sinned are sacred. I'm convinced that if our judicial system, even in the United States, even in a secular polity, could treat those who are condemned as sacred, we would find some things would change. For Jesus, human judgment must never be conflated with condemnation. Human justice must endeavor to lay down our condemnation. It must be done by those who have not been harmed by the person who is being judged. And human justice must treat even the one who has been decided to be in the wrong as sacred. Maybe we can understand why this principle morphs into the teachings of Paul as a prohibition against gossip. God is the only one who can condemn. To quote Dallas Willard once more, anger and condemnation, like vengeance, are safely left to God. We must beware of believing that it's okay for us to condemn as long as we're condemning the right things. It's not as so simple as all that. I can trust Jesus to go into the temple and drive out those who were profiting from religion, beating them with a rope. I cannot trust myself to do so. What Dallas Willard is reminding us is you and I can trust Jesus' anger. You should not trust your own. And I should not trust mine. When we're tasked with judging on earth, we're tasked with discerning to the best of our ability what behavior is acceptable and what behavior is not, and what the most just outcomes might be. But we're humans, and we can be wrong. And we should know, and this is what happened to Jesus, right? That even in the best of our discernment, we could decide someone is absolutely guilty. And when we stand before God, we may find out that we have executed an innocent person. That might happen. In fact, it is what happened to Jesus. He was condemned by the law, by the ruling authorities of his day, condemned by the law of Sinai, sentenced to death by the Roman Empire. And we find out later that all those systems of justice failed. He was innocent. That could happen to us too. We're humans. We can be wrong about any of these decisions. That shouldn't stop us from making them. We know that there's a God who can rectify all wrongs, but we should always know we can be wrong. Only God has the perspective necessary and the wisdom required to acquit or condemn someone ultimately. That's why final judgment is left to him. All you and I can do is discern to the best of our ability what's right and wrong now. And because of this, we must never judge from a place of condemnation or blame or self-rightness. When we must discern, when we must decide between right and wrong, we must do so seeing the person and not simply our feelings or opinions of his or her behavior. Also knowing that a person we discern to be in the wrong from the very best of our perspective may very well be innocent. And we may be taking up a cause against a godly person, believing them to be ungodly simply because we've been hurt. And finally, when action in our fallible discernment is required, we must respect the one being judged and treat the person as sacred from beginning to end. This is the way of the kingdom. And if we can learn to do this, Jesus is helping us to understand that loving our enemies will be implicit in this process. This is how you love your enemies. And forgiveness will happen too when we start to see the person and not just the pain. If we can trust true justice to God, while accepting the role we sometimes must play in this time between the times, we might find the freedom of discerning right from wrong without condemnation or blame. Many of us need to repent about this because many of us are self-righteous, aren't we? However evil a person's behavior, they are sacred. However worthy of judgment, we are dealing with the pearls of God. If we can accept that, we can start to become his people. He's not saying sin doesn't have to be dealt with, confronted, talked about, sometimes even disciplined. But it can't be done from a place of self-rightness, absoluteness, certainty, or condemnation. It can't be done by the person who was personally harmed by the issue we're dealing with. And the whole process has to be as respectful of the condemned as it is of the innocent victim. Can we live that way?